Hey YouTube, how the heck you doing? I'm doing great and I hope you are too. Today I'm going to bring you another head-to-head version of my 6D versus the RP EOS Canon cameras. I used the 100mm this time. It's a macro lens with a 2.8 aperture, so it's not the widest aperture, and we're just going to delve right into the pictures that I took. I'm only going to bring you 4 this time. I don't want to inundate you with all these, and I didn't see much of a difference with the macro lens as much as I did the other time. And I try to do a little better framing for you guys. So let's jump on in and see what we got here. So as I dive into this 10 photos that I have, you got the blue ones on the left side. That's from the RP camera. That's using a Camera Raw 3. And then the green ones on the right side and down below there, those are the 60 photos in the Camera Raw 2. So let's go ahead. We got the 2 selected for the keyboard. We'll go into comparison mode, and as you can see, the focus was probably a little bit off on the right here with the 6D compared to the RP, but it looks like equal amounts of noise is in there. Let me zoom in a little bit more. Being that the RP is the darker one, it does have noise that seems to show up a little bit harder, but both equally having noise in there. And as you look over to the side here on the information panel, you can see that the RP did a 1/80th of a second at an aperture of 2.8 with an ISO of 12,800. And as I switch over to the 6D, you got 1/50th of a second at 2.8 at 12,800 ISO. So comparable in the settings that they use, because I did have this camera on automatic. But let's go ahead and move on to our next candidate here. So our next candidate is a little shortwave radio that I've been using around here and there. And again, you can see that the RP on the left is a little bit darker in its exposure over the 6D here. Let me just move in or zoom in on the side there. And you can see that it does have similar graininess to it. As I move around, the AB button, a little darker noise on this RP compared to the 6D. It's very similar to the first photo. And if we go ahead and look at the info on the side, the RP did a 1/160 at 2.8 at 12,008. And our other candidate here did a 1/80th at 2.8 at 10,000 ISO. So it did lower the ISO a little bit better. As we move out, you can see it probably has a little bit nicer balance of coloring and everything. That can always be adjusted in Lightroom, obviously. So let's go on, move on to our next guy, and that will be our noisy candidate down below here that keeps giving me a comment. There is Mr. Reggie. We'll go ahead and zoom in on him, and let's try to get somewhat of a balance here. Let's see if I can move this guy up, this guy over. So that's a comparable area in the picture around the nose area. Very difficult to get him to coordinate and keep his head in the same position when you're trying to take a photo of a child, dog, or whatever it might be. But let's go ahead and look at the RP version. Again, you can see noise on this one. It looks like the noise is actually a little bit bigger and pixelated than it is on the 6D version. If you look in this area here, let me see if I can move it over to that area to get a little more. That's where his eye is. Let me pull down his eye. You can see it's a little darker, pixelated a little bit more, and a lot of noise in that area, in that dark shadow. See if we can get into the bridge of the nose on the 6D. Seem to balance that out a little bit better than the RP. The RP, looking at the selection here in the information, did a 12,800 ISO at 1/250th of a second at 2.8, and the 6D did a 1/80th 2.8 at 4,000. So it did drop the ISO down into the 4,000 range, where the RP was still up at the 12,800. So we're going to be playing with that down the road and making sure that at least we're in the same ISO or same speed of the shutter, or even at the same aperture. But for now, we're just going to be looking at these two guys. And then the last two, I was in the fish tank. Being a macro lens, we can always get in nice and close into a fish tank like that. So let's go ahead and select our two fish tank guys here. So as you can see on this one at a distance, they both have a good overall look of them. They're showing good contrast overall. The fall off or the bokeh on this one is pretty good on both. You got a nice blur on the background. Pretty good focus on the main character here, which is our coral. So let me zoom in here and then just reposition this guy at equal distance or equal area here. And if we go over to the second picture here, because we did happen to switch on, the RP is on the candidate side. You got an aperture of 2.8 obviously, ISO of 4,000, and 1/250th of a second on the exposure. And if we go into the 6D, you can see we have a 2 again, ISO of 1250 with an exposure of 1/80. So that is quite lower than the other one. A little shorter exposure. Looks like it has a little nicer contrast when you do the zoom in on the two there. That seems to bring in the shadows and the depth of the character of this coral pretty good. So let's go ahead and move on to our last and final picture that I have for you guys. Like I said, I didn't want to inundate you with too much stuff. So there you have it. On the last picture here is another picture of one of my other corals in the tank. And we are shooting through glass, so that does have an effect as far as the focus of the macro lens and everything. But we did pretty good on this one. You can see that the 6D, which is on the left hand side here, does have some good depth in the shadows and everything. But the RP on the right did seem to bring in the shadows a little bit better, although they are blown out because it is a macro lens as far as the focus on it. Overall, it looks like the one by the 6D did a little bit better. Again, you can compensate for underexposure in Lightroom. Overexposure, you usually lose some detail, and it's not easy to bring that back. But as we can see on these two, the 6D performed pretty good at 800 ISO, 2.8 and 1/80th. And then we have the RP that did 1/250th, 2.8 at ISO 5000. So quite a difference in the ISO between those two again. Going from 800 ISO to 5000, 250th. So it's, like I said, I'm going to play with that as far as getting a little more balance in the ISO or the exposure time down the road. I'll probably be using a couple lenses at that time or not, but as you can see, very comparable. A little overexposed on the RP, a little underexposed on the 6D, but overall good focus and depth of field as far as getting into the subject here. So guys, that was my quick take on the 5 photos that I took between the two cameras, the RP and 6D, using my 100mm macro. We're going to dive into it some more, and we'll see what we can do down the road. Have a good one, guys.